Mahatma Gandhi said that the greatness of a nation is its moral progress can be judged by the way its animals are treated. So how do we stand up to that assessment based on that criteria? Well, there are a lot of animals about in the Isle of Man, domestic pets, farm animals and wildlife. And in this week's programme, we're going to focus on the wildlife part of that equation. As yesterday, the Manx Wildlife Week got underway, and it'll finish next Saturday on the 28th. For many of us, particularly those who live in towns, we don't have much time to spend with nature. However, the homepage of the Manx Wildlife Trust tells us that time spent with nature can improve your health and overall well-being. And they say they work hard to protect the island's wildlife and to help people feel more connected. Well, what is Manx Wildlife Week about? What does the Manx Wildlife Trust do and why? And what is the scope of their activities on land, in the air, and on and under the sea? How do we fit into the wider global picture? And what can people see out and about at this time of year? How should they go about it? And what should they shouldn't do? Well, to help us answer these questions and much more, we welcome our today's studio guests. Dr. Tim Graham is the Chief Executive Officer of the Manx Wildlife Trust, and Dr. Lara Howe is the Trust's Marine Officer. Well, thank you both for joining us today. I gather, actually, you've joined us, Tim, on a rather busy day anyway, have you? You've got all sorts on.
Always seems to be a busy weekend. That's more to do with family life sometimes than how much we're trying to fit in with work.
Okay, so this Wildlife Week is not getting too much in your road then?
No, well, we were both active with the launch yesterday that M&H hosted for DEFA with Nature's Value conference and set of talks that went really well yesterday and was launched by Howard Quayle, Chief Minister.
So tell me about Wildlife Week. What is it?
This was an initiative set up as part of a partnership with Manx National Heritage and DEFA, so the Department for Food and Agriculture, with ourselves and a lot of other groups sort of involved as well. And really it was about a recognition for all the work that's going on behind the scenes, lots of volunteers sort of getting to know and understand our wildlife on the Isle of Man. There's been a lot of work that Manx National Heritage have been leading on, which is going to be launched as the NBN Atlas Isle of Man, which is going to be a website where people can actually really view what we know about wildlife and find out what's next to the house, what some of them are interested in going to see. So that's going to be great. Next to that launch, they've got some big events going on this week. We had the talks yesterday. We've got Simon King over that M&H has set up. That's going to be a fantastic opportunity for people to hear. And then he's taking a select group out around the island, giving a bit of an expert masterclass as well.
About what?
So that's going to be photography and really getting to grips with understanding wildlife and being able to film and take photos. So understanding the subject matter and getting out into the Manx countryside and really helping a nice select group get to grips and learn some of the tricks and tips from Simon King. Should be exciting.
I'm looking forward to it because I've been one of the lucky few.
Oh, have you? You see, I didn't even know that. So, fantastic! Oh, there we go.
So you've equipped yourself with more than your phone, then, have you? You're ready to
absolutely. Go. Yeah, the camera gear will be coming on mass with me.
Right. But are these events chargeable or are they free?
There's quite a range. So I think Simon King was about being able to actually book, wasn't it? So it, although might not be a charge, it's about booking on because of how popular some of these are. So you can get onto our website. We've got links, but lots of them are bookable through Manx National Heritage website and things. Obviously, these have been circling around in the media for a while, so we know Simon King sold out, and obviously for obvious reasons, quite quickly.
Okay. Well, I'm looking at just some of the lists that I picked off for Manx Wildlife Week. You're talking about photography, you might be talking about people want to look at birds or other things, but I found there seems to be quite a range. Some of them are almost obscure subjects to somebody like me. For instance, leaf litter lab for litter bugs and pollen cores. Well, I mean, what are these things?
So this is all about trying to explore how many different ways people could sort of learn about what's going on to give us information about wildlife as well. So there's a range of wildlife just linked to leaf litter in the ground. So, finding those insects and beetles and things and what that says about our environment. Often some people might not have just taken that little bit of time. This will give them a chance to really get to grips, have a go, see what's there and sort of get their hands dirty, find out a little bit more. And then The stuff about the pollen, well, there's actually a bit of expertise based on Ireland linked to this, and obviously it can help if you say sample some peat that's out there that was deposited sort of centuries ago. You find out what pollen was in, you know what plants were around, so it tells us a lot about environmental change and what wildlife used to be here, things like that.
As you talk about pollen, peat, members of my family used to go and dig peat. I always remember the smell of it when it was burning. It was almost like flowers, fragrant.
Fragrant, yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the big things, on the Isle of Man, looking at what we can do linked to the peatland habitats. It's one of the priorities for the Wildlife Trust.
Right, well, let's come to the Wildlife Trust then. Founded in 1973, what does it do?
What do we do? Well, we're all about Manx wildlife, as you might expect, and it's not just about the wildlife per se. We've got these amazing nature reserves, and that's the beating heart of what we do, saving places for wildlife. But it's also about people and wildlife, so people understanding and valuing wildlife, and that's a huge part of it. So obviously, if we're thinking about what might have an impact on wildlife, then it's normally linked to people and things. So the more we understand it, the more we get out and experience it, the more likely we are to really value it and want to save it.
So what would you say? Is it conservation you do, or is it education that you do? Well, can you categorise what you do, or is it all together in one sort of stew?
I'd say our conservation work, it has to be part of education. It's about really engaging with people, as well as the very specific projects we might take. So Lara's got a great example linked to the puffins on the calf, where we're trying to encourage species recovery and things. So it's about all of it. It needs all of the different parts, really. Certainly, without bringing people along as part of that ride, it just wouldn't work long term. So that's where the membership, the volunteers, the way we try and work with community and the people on the Isle of Man, that's the long term success.
What sort of numbers have you got then, and volunteers, members?
So in terms of members, we're just over 1,200 members. So
all Manx based? So
we've got a few across actually as well. So people who are really struck with the island because it's such a special place. So I think we've probably got about 20 people who are sort of based across in terms of members as well. But they've all got some kind of connection, whether they were born here or whether they holidayed here or spent some time here. There's usually something. So a few of them were from the Port Erin Marine Lab and obviously moved around the world linked to work and things.
Now, as I said in the introduction, you say right at the front of your website, time spent in nature can improve your health and overall well-being. How does it do that?
How does it do it? Wow. Well, this is quite a new area. I have to say it's quite technical as well. But over the last few years, we've really been getting to grips with understanding what it contributes to us, how it makes us feel. So people going out and spending time might be used to just listening to the sound of the waves when we're walking the coastal path, the sound of birds in the morning, things like that, and you can really feel yourself de-stress and the impact that fresh air can have if you're walking the hills. So some of it is about that, and lots of us can connect with that. But there's quite specific some medical trials that have started to inquire about this, and so people can recover faster from surgery with views of wild landscapes. We know that commuters are less stressful in work if they've got a route with wild spaces on the commute, things like that. So it's really interesting. The other thing is that kids are found to actually attain more in school through the time outdoors and things. So there's all these things coming out about why we really do need to look after our wildlife.
That sounds as if the individual is in the role of an observer almost, but you actually say you work hard to help people be more connected to nature. How does the connection work?
I think that's about us really understanding the value, but also realising that it's relevant to us, where it fits in everyday life. It might be as much as just having a walk in the local park, or getting out in the fresh air. So I live in Peel, just a quick walk to Peel Hill and things, and that becoming part of everyday life. So it just starts blossoming from there. It might be understanding more. We've got a lot of people who are obviously members because they really understand. It might be birds, it might be something else from the wildlife that really they just know we can't do without. So it can get quite specific.
Is this an age thing? How does this fit, but you find so many organisations, people's awareness start to develop from middle age onwards. I mean, is it that the case? Is it middle age to elderly, or do you have a young people with you as well? Are you bringing youngsters along?
Yes, yeah. Well, we have our Wildlife Watch, which is our junior membership as well. So our work is very much about the young, as well as our work with schools and things like that we do in partnership with the government. But we've got quite a range. Obviously, a lot of our volunteers are people with time. A lot of them are sort of retired and got to that stage, they're a little bit older. But what we find in terms of valuing nature, in some ways, it's both ends of the spectrum. That young people don't understand why we aren't taking the right action, and the old people are really valuing it. They don't want to see it. They've really grown up and perhaps even seen something different because they grew up being able to listen to more curlews locally, something like that.
You should say that. I can remember as a young child listening to curlews. I haven't heard one for years.
Yeah, they've been struggling everywhere around the British Isles, but
Yes.
absolutely, it's something that comes up a lot with members. And obviously I work with other organisations as well, so the fact that people won't grow up in the future perhaps being able to remember curlew song or be able to see lapwings, well, that's what we want to make sure doesn't happen. So that's where some of the action, the real conservation,
You find
needs
the
to
sound
happen.
of a curlew appears in a lot of old poetry. It's quite often it appears, isn't it? You hear it when it comes to written maybe 100 years ago, maybe
Yeah.
before. Yes.
It's an outstanding noise, and it's actually the calls of birds and things like that often people, that's a real connection people find. I know you're doing you've been out with an ID group that were learning bird ID and things just this morning, weren't you?
Yeah, we were out listening. We were trying to listen to decide whether one of the birds we'd seen, whether it was a willow warbler or a chiffchaff, and we listened, and you could tell it was a chiffchaff because of the sound it made. So yeah, it's things
But you
like
need
that.
to know what you're listening to be able to do that.
Yeah, it helps, definitely. We're quite a good group of mixed abilities, so there's always somebody who knows what it should sound like or what it shouldn't, and so yeah, it's really good.
I can recognise some birds, some of them more obvious than others, but we have a small cottage, as well as living in Douglas, in the north of the island, and very surprised at this last weekend to discover we'd acquired a cuckoo, which never been there before. So they're a migratory bird, aren't they? They come in.
Yes, they are. So it's one of those nice kind of connections sort of beyond the island in terms of some of the migratory birds that come in. And obviously that call is quite a standout call as well. Something that, again, perhaps people used to remember more as part of their springtime lives and things, and it's now harder to see.
I see on another part of the information about you, you're acquiring land for nature reserves to act as safe sites for wildlife. Acquiring land can be an expensive process.
It certainly can. So we've got 24 nature reserves, and obviously that's taken some time since 1973, and that's through raising money, donations, people being kind enough to leave us legacies, but also, specific gifts of land can be one of the routes that we're actually taking hold of nature reserves and doing work.
Yeah.
for
So when
wildlife.
you get the land, it's basically fairly wild, is it? You have to do something with it.
So one of the big things is always understanding what's important about the land, what's its conservation features and things. So we're lucky enough to have a long-term reserve officer who writes what's called management plans. So we get to grips with what's valuable in the area and where the reserve fits into that, and then there may or may not be management actions linked to it. So the decision not to have any action is a sort of decision in itself, really. A bit of an
So
action.
the funding comes from a wide set of sources then, apart, as you say.
Yeah.
Do you do any government contract work?
Yes, we do. Our biggest contract is the one that Lara's involved in with Manx National Heritage and doing the calf work. So we employ the wardens who are out there for about 8 months of the year, doing amazing work on one of the most unique places, in the British Isles, really.
I see you got a vacancy for an assistant on the calf.
It's just been filled. And he went over this week.
Yeah.
So there's 3 wardens there now. Yeah, so they'll get even more done.
Well, what do they do? It's a fairly isolated, in that sense, it's isolated, not that far away, but it's separated from the rest of the island, so they live out there. What do they do?
An awful lot, actually. They work very hard. So there is the ornithological warden, Aaron, who's out there, who looks after the birds. So he rings every day, weather permitting, and does monitoring, nest monitoring, seabird colony monitoring, and generally notes down birds they see throughout the day as well. And of course Nathan, the estate warden, and Daniel, our assistant warden, help with that as well. And then Nathan's side of the work is to help with check the monitoring for the shearwater work and to check the bait points to make sure we haven't had any furry visitors returning to the calf.
Have you got rid of longtails?
I'm afraid to say we found one last week.
Oh dear.
Well, we found signs
As
of
long as
one
you didn't
last
find
week.
two.
Yes. Hopefully only one. So of course then the contingency grid then goes out and we do everything we can to try and remove that individual. But we have to be 2 years clear before we can say that we've been successful at clearing the longtails.
So how important is the Calf of Man internationally?
Well, it's one of the bird observatories around the UK, so it's very important for that reason, but also in terms of its biodiversity in general. It's an amazing site. We have great wildflowers, obviously our bird species, but also it's quite good for our seals, which is why that we do our seal monitoring in the autumn for the pups round the calf. We see more seals around the calf than we do around the rest of the island.
Is that because there are no people?
Quite possibly, yes. I think they like to haul out and rest up without being disturbed or the potential for disturbance, so I would say that's quite possible, yes.
I asked that because if I remember rightly, last year was a very poor year for seal pups.
Yes, it was. They sadly got badly affected by Stormophilia, yeah.
We lost about. Yeah.
We lost about 40% last year, yeah.
This year looks as if it's quite good.
Fingers crossed. It's early days, but fingers crossed we'll have a good year.
And do these seals literally live all the time around the Isle of Man, or do they go off somewhere else?
Well, that's a question we'd really like to answer. The data that we're getting from the seal surveys is showing that during the pupping season we'll get individuals that come back that we see every year, but then we also get new individuals coming in through the photo ID work. So we don't know whether they're mature pups who were born on the calf years ago and now sexually mature and they're coming back to have their own pups, or whether they're individuals coming in from elsewhere. We know from other work that's been done by other groups in the wider Irish Sea that we have seals coming over from Strangford Lough to the Sound area around there, and also to the north of the island, and some of the Welsh seals have been coming to us as well. But we really don't know what our population is doing. Is it resident? Is it more mobile? We just don't know, sadly.
They tend to go where the food is, don't they?
Yeah, they do.
Is there enough for them in the Irish Sea?
There seems to be. The surveys would suggest that we're getting increasing numbers in pups over the years, so it would suggest that there's ample food supply, which is good to see. And when we did the island-wide surveys last year, just looking at distribution and abundance and comparing it to the earlier work that Manx BirdLife had done about 10 years previous, although it was a bit of a snapshot survey that we did, it would suggest that there's been an increase since that last survey 10 years before. So I think there is plenty of food around for them, and there needs to be as well.
What other marine creatures turn up at the same time? We all know about basking sharks, who seem to have good years for our point of view, good years and bad years. But what else comes to our waters these days?
In terms of the big megafauna and things like that, we have harbour porpoise round Manx waters all year round, which is the smallest of our sort of cetacean species that come. In the autumn, sort of late summer, early autumn, we have the minke whales that you just see round the corner at Marine Drive here, that come in to feed on the spawning herring. So they're a nice one to see quite often. We had quite a good year for them last year, I think. We also have Rizzo dolphins that come in, and we see quite a lot of those. I think we've got, I can't remember what the figure is now, but Manx Whale and Dolphin Watch do a photo ID catalogue for them, and I think we've got something like 100 individuals that they've been able to
They're
identify.
identifiable by sight, aren't they?
Yes, yeah, they go white as they get older due to scarring, and that helps them identify them, and any nicks and cuts and things like that in the fin shape as well.
What's the difference between a porpoise and a dolphin?
It's the shape of their teeth. They've got different shaped teeth, but really they're all whales. So you've got toothed whales and baleen whales. So dolphins are just toothed whales, and porpoises are toothed whales. So technically they're all whales.
Two versions of a dog almost.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that's out at sea. We come back to the sea baby in a moment, Lara, but coming back to the organisation again, the Wildlife Trust, you talked about nature reserves, Tim. And I looked on the list and it said you have 9 open and 15 closed. How does that come about? What does that mean?
So we've got 9 that are open to the public, so people can go along, and you know they're reasonably accessible. One of them's pretty much access for all at Close Sartfield. So you know, in terms of going along even in a wheelchair, potentially, you know, you're able to get around at least a good section and see some of the key features. Now, the other closed reserves are all closed for various different reasons, whether the fact that there's no actual access that's easy. So we might only have permissive access and it's through numerous fields, things like that. There might not be a path that's nearby or through it, or it might be about the fact that it's very sensitive species or habitat as well, in terms of being able to take some of that pressure that people bring with them.
Do you look after, you're talking about animals here, we have one somewhere up in Sulby, don't you? There's just flowers, really, wildlife flowers. And that's one I presume you can walk around on paths, but not on the ground.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, Close Sartfield.
Yeah.
That's the one we're talking about.
Yeah. So there's a fantastic fantastic boardwalk that really helps you get around. Not only to stop you just walking through the orchids and plants, but the fact that actually it can also potentially be wet, etc. as well. So it keeps you that little bit up from the ground level as well. And
the 2 visitor centres, what's the purpose of those?
Well, that's all about being able to try and engage with the public, especially at important sites. So we've got one at Scarlet on the edge of Castletown. That's obviously renowned in terms of marine and geological features, as well as having close by a key wildlife walk and coastal habitats. And then up in the north, we've got the Ayers Visitor Centre, which is right in the middle of the Ayers National Nature Reserve.
And these are open when?
So these are open during the main sort of tourist season, and that's 2 till 5, half 4. All the information's on our website. Now? So they're not actually open. So they opened previously for Easter often, and then they'll be opening again in May.
Right. Now, let me just move over to one more thing before we move off as far then as the trust is concerned. You talked about managing, you talked about partnership and various things, but a lot of organisations like this in some countries tend to go into some sort of research, academic or otherwise. Do you get much research done?
Well, it's part of our remit, to be able to actually understand more about wildlife. Obviously, Laura's mentioned the fact that what we would really like to know is more about the seals, which might involve tagging some seals in the future and things, and really embedding that with research partners. That would be the route that we would seek to kind of work with some of the big academic teams that actually undertake this elsewhere as well. So it's an important part of what we want to do. It's all about funding again and how we link with that. Getting the right expertise. Sometimes we're lucky to have the expertise in our staff.
For research projects, sometimes though, there's commercial funding going, isn't it?
So potentially, yeah. Sometimes we can fall a little bit off the grid depending how strict they are with UK research funding and that side of it, because obviously not being part of the UK or EU, it depends where their sources for the academics. Sometimes if we're able to contribute the time, the samples, things like that, actually it's just about including them in an analysis for our partners, so we can actually send off DNA samples, things like that. Or we're actually doing work, so thinking about the strandings and things, and
small shark tagging work as well, that we do on behalf of DEFRA. So there is lots of
How do you tag a shark? It's a big thing, isn't it?
Yes.
Some of them, anyway.
These are our sort of small shark species, so things like tope and bullhuss and spur dog. Still, a good considerable size and length, but it's about getting experienced anglers to be able to tag it, so they know how to handle the sharks and bring them either onto the beach if they're shore fishing, or safely onto the boat. And then we have these tiny little streamer tags that we effectively sort of inject under the skin, into the
they're
shark.
thin or somewhere, is it?
Yeah, they're very thin. They're probably a bit shorter than the length of your finger, and probably
Okay.
only a few millimetres in diameter. And there's a unique number on them, and we take some biological measurements, so the length and the girth and things like that, and the sex of the species, and with the aim to hopefully capture them at a later date and remeasure them and see how they're growing.
Now, these are small sharks. I mean, I can remember small sharks in the sense of dogfish when I was a kid.
Oh no, they're
little
bigger
sharks,
than
aren't they?
that.
They're
Yeah,
bigger than
they're
that.
bigger.
Yeah.
So they're probably about 1 metre in length,
Right.
sometimes a bit more than that. So it's not like you're trying to bring a basking shark into a boat, but bigger than a dogfish. Yeah.
Well, do we get any of the more, we would say dangerous, but certainly the bigger sharks that you see in warmer waters with this climate change? Are we getting any coming northwards?
I don't think anyone's reported anything.
Somebody in
that
Cornwall, I
sense.
noticed it.
Yeah.
I was just thinking
Yeah,
that
not
there's
in
been
our
the odd,
waters,
yeah, there's been the odd report down there with probably linked with different sort of permutations of the Gulf Stream and things as well.
But
So-
luckily not Manx waters, so it's safe to go swimming.
10 marine protected areas.
Yes.
Could you explain that?
Well, obviously, this is a lot of work that DEFRA have been involved in, and we've helped wherever we can, of course. So this has been a very slow progression from, I think it was 2008, where DEFRA had a consultation process where we all came together, the public, other groups like ourselves, to discuss where marine nature reserves might want to be, and it progressed from there. So of course Ramsey Bay was one of the first marine protected areas. Obviously we've got the original fisheries closed areas, or the fisheries restricted areas, so Port Erin, Niarbol, Laxey, Douglas, Port Erin being one of the first closed areas in the UK, and that kicked it all off in the 80s, and a result of that more sites have been designated, which is why now we have these 10 marine protected areas. And the great news is that the fishermen are all on board with this. They see the benefits of it, and of course it's protection for the wildlife as well.
What about Manx fishermen? It might be from other countries that don't quite see it that way.
Well, yes, but the Manx fishermen have been very supportive. They were the ones who suggested Ramsey Bay as a marine protected area, and they've been very supportive, and that's how these other new zones have come about, the larger ones that now make up the 10 protected areas.
Do you think it's possible, even though designating them, is it possible to police them fully? Is it possible to enforce these regulations, whatever they may be, on these areas?
Absolutely. Obviously, the DEFRA have the Barul, their enforcement vessel, so they use that to go out. But also, of course, the fishing vessels have an electronic tagging system called VMS, for the want of it, and basically they know where all the fishermen are, so they can tell from the speed that they're travelling at whether they're dredging or whether they're just moving through an area. So there is a monitoring system in place to ensure that does happen, and where the fishermen are maybe not quite following the rules, then of course you'll have seen lately they've been prosecuted in the local news.
Yeah, fined, and they're not paid the fine.
Oh, well, yeah.
So
It's not a perfect system, but generally the fishermen are, like I said, are on board, so it's not really a problem.
And are these areas just purely to do with fishing, or are there other things in them that are to be protected?
So the originally it was about restricting mobile fishing gear, so for scallops, because of the damage it does to the seabed. So not only does it benefit sort of scallop recovery, but it benefits everything else that lives on the seabed, particularly fragile species. And then of course, as you get more and more scallops and things, they overspill into the areas where the fishing can take place. So that's why the fishermen are very supportive of it. And of course it brings in everything else. We've got obviously certain habitats that are OSPAR protected, so things like our seagrass, our horse mussels, our merle, all of these things are all protected within these new zones, which is fantastic.
And the creatures that live within them?
Oh yeah, there's yes, everything under the new legislation, which is under the designation. It means that everything is protected, so it's fantastic. And some areas have greater protection than others, so a lot of them it's just for mobile gear, But some areas, particularly like, for example, in Ramsey Bay, there's a complete no-take zone in certain areas. Or you're not allowed to put anchors down in certain areas, for example, in the eelgrass, because that can damage the seagrass as well.
I read somewhere that our waters now are a good holiday destination for scuba divers.
Absolutely, yes. I'm a diver myself, and I rate the island. I think it is one of the best UK places for diving. I really do. Some of the habitats, particularly around the Calf, are absolutely stunning.
Clear water?
Yeah, relatively clear water for sort of temperate waters, definitely.
Is it a lot like, I'd say, for nature tourism, although we might not push it as much as we'd obviously like as Manx Wildlife Trust, but you've got such access to amazing places that, you know, you've got all these marine habitats, thinking about the divers, but in a lot of places, if you found one habitat, it wouldn't just be an easy trip to adjust, or if the weather's meaning you can't dive off the west coast, you're likely to be able to dive off the east coast and get there, you know, within a very reasonable time. That means that it's just really practical, I'd have thought.
Yeah, because I mean, we dive all throughout the year, even in the winter. It usually.
Do we promote this?
Sorry?
Do we promote it?
Not enough. Not enough.
Always room for more.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it really is a jewel in our crown that we don't promote enough. I think it's very easy to show people and share the wonderful terrestrial habitats we have around the island, because they're very easily and accessible for people, but to really be able to showcase the marine environment is much harder, and that's something I'm keen to promote. I think we talk a lot, we've already mentioned our big stuff like our seals and our dolphins and our whales and obviously our basking sharks, but what people don't really realise is how beautiful the small stuff is that you don't tend to see, because it doesn't come to the surface, because it's 10-20 metres down. And that's something that I'm keen to try and shout about more, is the small stuff, the habitats, the species that you don't get to see unless you're a scuba diver.
Right, very good. Well, it's time for a short commercial break, and we'll be back with more about Manx wildlife in about 3 minutes.